before the dragon-headed sails appeared along Europe's coasts. The lands of the far north lay in cold silence. This was a world of dense forests, towering mountains, and winding rivers flowing through snow-covered valleys. In the early 8th century, few had ever spoken the word Viking. These people were simply small communities scattered across the remote valleys of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They lived quiet lives, self-sufficient, fishing in icy waters, farming on poor soil, and surviving off the forests that surrounded them. Life was not easy. The land was harsh, the winters long, and the summers brief. The struggle to grow food was constant. They relied on small boats to fish and to trade with other villages across the fjords. The family was the center of life. The father was the blacksmith, the hunter, the protector, and the storyteller. History wasn't written down yet, so the past was kept alive through stories, passed from one generation to the next. Each night, families would sit around the fire, listening to tales of Thor, Odin, and the mighty world tree Yggdrasil, or of the final battle at Ragnarok. There were no kings, no empires, just strong clan leaders who gained respect not through wealth, but through bravery, wisdom, and the ability to protect the people. In these rugged lands, they forged a society where honor and courage mattered more than status or riches. Their gods were not distant, silent beings. They were warriors, lovers, tricksters, and seers. The line between the mortal and divine was thin in the minds of these northern people. They believed that to die in battle was the greatest fate. It meant being chosen to join the heroes in Valhalla, the grand hall of fallen warriors. This belief was not just religion. It was part of their identity, the way they faced danger and hardship. It fed a spirit of fearlessness, of facing the world with boldness no matter the cost. It was this spirit that would shape a generation of seafarers who would one day sail beyond the edge of what they knew, seeking something more. As the population grew and resources stretched thin, tensions began to rise between clans and families. Some began to dream of new lands, of softer soil, warmer winds, and better lives. They built bigger ships, sturdier hulls that could brave the open seas. These ships would become the very symbol of the Viking Age, carrying both hope and terror into distant lands. But before that happened, the people of the north were still farmers and craftsmen. Fathers taught sons how to track a reindeer, how to sharpen an axe, how to pitch a tent in the snow. They enjoyed contests of strength, storytelling games, and playing Nefatafel, a board game of strategy and war. Their lives, though hard, were filled with strong bonds of family and community. They celebrated harvests, held rituals for the gods, and prayed for mild winters. They danced, they sang, and they drank mead, a sweet honey wine, to drive away the cold. The first whispers of change came quietly. Travelers returned from the south, from the lands of the Anglo-Saxons, with stories of fertile fields, churches filled with silver and gold, and towns with few warriors to defend them. These tales burned like slow fire in the minds of restless young men. Some began to mend their ships not just for fishing, but for long journeys. They sharpened blades not for the hunt, but for battle. They didn't know yet where they would go, but the dream had begun. Maybe it was the long nights without sun, the snow-covered roofs, the wind howling through empty trees. Maybe those things planted the seed of longing, a desire to leave these cold homelands and find warmth, light, and something better. They were not born to plunder. They were pushed by need, by ambition, by dreams whispered through generations. Still, their journey had not yet begun. The Viking story was only fragments, distant drums no one could hear clearly. It would not be until the spring of 793, when a peaceful monastery at Lindisfarne was suddenly attacked, that the world would feel the first true shockwave from the north. The old order would never be the same again. In the spring of the year 793, the sea was calm, the skies above Northumbria pale and grey, and the monastery at Lindisfarne rested quietly on the edge of a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of England. It was a sacred place, home to monks who had devoted their lives to quiet prayer and peaceful labor. The scent of salt hung in the wind, cattle grazed lazily in the distance, chanting drifted through the stone halls, soft and steady. No one expected what came next. Out of the mist came longships, sleek and strange, their carved dragon heads stretched toward the shore, slicing through the waves. No banners flew, no trumpets sounded. There was only the sound of oars moving in rhythm and the whisper of leather sandals on wet sand. Then came shouting, then steel. The monks had no weapons. Their walls were not fortified. They had nothing but holy books and faith. The attack on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking raid in history, but it was the first that left an echo so loud it reached the ears of every scribe, noble, and priest in Christian Europe. Monks who survived fled into the countryside, speaking of terrifying men with wild hair and painted faces, of axes that tore through doors like paper, of sacred altars smashed, of relics stolen, of blood on stone floors where prayers had once been whispered. For the people of England and beyond, the raid felt like something otherworldly. The Vikings, still nameless to many, became demons in human form. Some believed they had been sent by God as punishment for sin. Others thought they were monsters, not truly men. The reality was far simpler and far more human. The men on those longships were not demons. They were fishermen, warriors, blacksmiths, and sons. They had sailed across a treacherous sea in search of silver, food, and glory. The monastery at Lindisfarne was wealthy, unguarded, and filled with objects of gold, manuscripts, and cattle. To the Vikings, it was not holy, it was opportunity. News of the raid spread quickly. Letters were sent from bishops to kings. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the earliest records of English history, wrote that terrible omens had been seen before the attack. Fiery dragons were said to have flown across the sky. The earth trembled, people wept in the streets. Whether those signs were real or imagined, fear had taken root. But what began at Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Other raids followed. In 794, more longships attacked the coast near Jarrow. In 795, the island of Iona was struck. The pattern was clear: churches, monasteries, and wealthy coastal towns were all at risk. The Vikings preferred these places because they were rich in silver and rarely defended by soldiers. Their hit-and-run tactics made it nearly impossible for kings to respond in time. One moment the sea was empty. The next, it was full of sails. Unlike traditional armies, Viking raiding parties were small and fast. A single longship could carry 20 to 60 warriors. They needed no roads. They needed no permission. Rivers became highways. Inlets became secret doors. They could appear and vanish like ghosts. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering. Built from oak, they were long, narrow, and shallow-bottomed, which allowed them to travel deep into rivers and even be pulled across land when needed. Each vessel had a single sail and dozens of oars. When the wind died or a river narrowed, the Vikings rowed, tireless, coordinated, silent if they had to be. These ships would one day reach the gates of Paris, the shores of Spain, and even the sands of North Africa. But in 793, they were still shadows, still myths in the minds of frightened monks. In the north, however, they were the future. A generation of young Norsemen now heard stories not just of gods and giants, but of silver chalices, fat cattle, and lands where the sun was warm and the people weak. The raid on Lindisfarne did more than open a new chapter in European history. It opened a door in the minds of the Norse. They had tested the edge of the world and found it full of riches. Back in the fjords and valleys of Scandinavia, word spread quickly. The young listened, the old remembered the hunger of past winters, and the shipbuilders went to work. Soon, raiding became a cycle. In the spring, longships set sail. In the autumn, they returned with silver, weapons, and tales of distant lands. At first, the raids were small, seasonal, and scattered, but they grew. The rewards were too great. And as more Viking bands joined the hunt, some leaders began to think beyond raiding. If one could take silver, why not take land? If one could steal food, why not grow it in a warmer place? If a monastery could be robbed, could it also be held? What had begun as a strike in the mist was now becoming something else. Something larger, something no king of Europe was prepared for. But all of that was still to come. For now, Lindisfarne burned, and the world was listening. By the early 800s, the rhythm of the Viking world had changed. Spring no longer meant just the thawing of snow or the planting of barley. It meant preparation. The sails were mended, the axes sharpened, the hulls of longships were coated in tar. Young men trained with shields and spears. Old men traced the stars and tides. From small inlets and quiet fjords, hundreds of boats slipped out onto the open sea, not as a single army but as threads of a growing movement. Each year, more joined. Some went for silver, some for stories, some simply to escape the hunger of their villages or the shadow of powerful fathers. But whatever the reason, the destination was often the same: the soft underbelly of Western Europe. A place of monasteries, markets, and gold-covered crosses. In Ireland, the raiders found rivers like roads and monasteries that glittered like treasure chests. They struck places like Glendalough, Armagh, and Clonmacnoise. At first, they raided and vanished, but soon they stayed. By the 840s, Vikings had established winter camps in Dublin and other parts of the Irish coast. They no longer came just for plunder. They came to settle. In England, the story grew darker. The Saxon kingdoms, though brave, were often divided and slow to respond. Some tried to pay the raiders to leave. Others tried to fight, but the Vikings were elusive. One moment they were raiding the east. The next, they were in the north or sailing up the Thames. No wall was high enough. No prayer strong enough. Still, not all Vikings came as destroyers. Some came as traders. Along the coasts of Francia and the Low Countries, Viking ships filled with amber, furs, and walrus ivory met local merchants who were eager to do business. In cities like Dorestad, commerce flourished alongside fear. It was not uncommon for a Viking to raid one week and trade the next. Sometimes even with the same people. The line between enemy and merchant was never clear. And so, Europe began to adapt. Fortified bridges were built across rivers to block the longships. Coastal towns constructed walls. Kings ordered beacons on hills to warn of sails. But even as defenses grew, so too did the scale of the Viking incursions. What had once been a few dozen ships became hundreds. What had been mere raids turned into invasions. At home in Scandinavia, a quiet transformation was underway. The riches brought back by raiders began to reshape society. Leaders who returned with silver and slaves gained power and influence. Some began calling themselves kings. Others built wooden halls and gathered loyal warriors. The Viking world, once scattered and tribal, was slowly forming into something larger, something more organized. This growing wealth also brought new ideas. Foreign priests were captured in raids and sometimes spared in exchange for knowledge. Through them, the Vikings heard of Christianity. They heard of a God who forgave, a God who offered paradise without the need to die in battle. It was strange and unfamiliar, so unlike Odin and Thor. But over time, these new beliefs began to take root, especially among those who settled abroad. In the east, the Vikings went beyond the boundaries of Europe. They followed rivers into the heart of Russia, becoming known as the Rus. Some traded with the Byzantines in Constantinople. Others served as elite guards for the emperor. They were not just raiders anymore. They were adventurers, merchants, and sometimes mercenaries for foreign kings. But even as their world expanded, the core of Viking life remained the same. Around fires in the north, stories were still told of distant lands, of brave warriors, and of dragons sleeping beneath the sea. The longships still launched with the same quiet resolve. The waves still broke over the same rocky shores. The men still sang the same songs, steady and deep, as their oars cut through the water. They believed in fate, not fortune. They believed in deeds, not words, and they believed that the sea would always offer a path to greatness. Not all who sailed returned. Many died in foreign lands, their names forgotten, but others became legends. Names like Ragnar, Bjorn, and Ivar would one day fill sagas sung across generations. But those stories were still being written. What mattered now was the change, a quiet shift in the wind, a growing sense that the world beyond the fjords was vast, rich, and full of possibility. The age of raiding was not over, but something deeper had begun, a hunger not just for gold, but for land, for legacy, and for a place in the world beyond the ice and stone of home. By the middle of the 9th century, Europe had begun to realize that the Vikings were not a passing storm. They were not mere pirates. They were something else entirely. They were builders now, settlers, kings in their own right. Their longships still came on the tide, but more and more of them stayed behind, not just to plunder but to plant, to trade, to rule. In the eastern part of England, a group of Viking warbands formed what would come to be called the Great Heathen Army. This was not a raiding party of a few dozen ships. This was an invasion. Thousands of warriors came ashore. They were led by men whose names were whispered across kingdoms: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubbi, sons, perhaps, of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, though the truth was already tangled in myth. The Great Heathen Army moved through England like a tide. Northumbria fell, then East Anglia, then Mercia. Towns were seized, forts were built, churches were turned into halls, fields were tilled by Viking hands. For years, the army campaigned, making and breaking peace with local kings, carving out territory, establishing rule. It was not all fire and sword. Though the Vikings were fierce in battle, they were also adaptable. In places they conquered, they learned the local tongue. They married local women. They minted coins. They established laws. The Danelaw was born, a vast stretch of English territory under Viking control, where Norse customs blended with Saxon traditions, creating a culture that was neither one nor the other but something new. In Ireland, the Viking settlements grew into cities. Dublin, founded by Norsemen, became a bustling port. Ships arrived from Scandinavia, the British Isles, even distant Frankish coasts. Goods were traded, stories exchanged, children born who would never see the fjords of their ancestors. The line between raider and resident blurred further. And in the Kingdom of Francia, what had once been repeated Viking attacks gave way to negotiation. In 911, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, made a decision that would echo through history. He granted land in northern Francia to a Viking leader named Rollo. In exchange, Rollo swore loyalty, converted to Christianity, and agreed to protect the land from future raids. Thus, Normandy was born, the land of the Northmen, a place where Viking warriors became feudal lords. The transformation was quiet but profound. The Norse were still proud of their roots, still told tales of Odin and the sagas, but they had learned to govern. They had learned the power of alliances, of law, of territory. Even within Scandinavia, the same change was underway. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, chieftains fought not just for glory, but for thrones. The old tribal ways gave way to kingdoms. Kings emerged who claimed not just villages but entire realms. One of them, Harald Fairhair of Norway, vowed to unite the land under one crown. It took years of war, but he succeeded, and with unity came the need for stability. Raiding still happened, but now it was often state-sanctioned, controlled, directed. The Norse began building not just ships but cities. Towns like Kalpong in Norway, Hedeby in Denmark, and Birka in Sweden grew into trading centers. Marketplaces bustled, craftsmen worked with silver, leather, bone, and wool. Ships from the east brought silk and spices. From the west came swords and wine. The Viking world was no longer just a world of axes and oaths. It was a web of trade, politics, and ambition. Christianity, too, was taking root, slowly at first. Many resisted. The old gods were still powerful, still feared, still honored, but as more Norsemen settled in Christian lands, the pressure to convert grew. Some did so for belief, others for politics. To be a Christian meant access to allies. It meant peace with kings. It meant legitimacy. And so, baptismal fonts were carved where once there were altars to Thor. Crosses were worn beside hammers. And over time, entire communities shifted their faith. Not always with violence, sometimes simply with the passing of generations. A Viking child raised in York might grow up knowing both the sagas and the Psalms. Still, not all looked kindly on the change. In the north, there were those who whispered that the old ways were fading too fast, that the sea no longer called to the young, that gold and politics were replacing courage and honor. But the world had changed, and the Norse had changed with it. And yet, even in this age of settlement, stories of far journeys still stirred the hearts of many. For beyond the edges of familiar coasts, new lands still waited. In Iceland, in Greenland, and perhaps even further still, the sea continued to whisper. The raiders had become rulers, but their sails had not yet fallen silent. The Viking spirit, though changed by time, never lost its longing for the horizon. Even as kingdoms rose and cities grew, even as churches replaced shrines and coins replaced rings, the sea remained. Its rhythm still spoke to those born under northern skies. And for a new generation, the call was not for conquest, but for discovery. In the late 9th century, Norse settlers began to leave Norway for a strange volcanic island far out in the North Atlantic. The place was harsh, windswept, and empty of cities or kings. But it was green in places, and there were fish, and the land could be tamed. They called it Iceland. The Icelandic settlers brought with them not only livestock and tools but also stories. In the darkness of long winters, they told tales of gods, monsters, and heroes. They wrote laws in memory. They built a parliament, the Althing, where disputes could be resolved not with swords, but with words. Iceland became a haven for poets and dreamers, a society both rugged and wise. But the journey did not end there. From Iceland, some went further still, into the mists beyond. A man named Eric the Red, exiled for murder, sailed west with a fleet of followers. He found a land of icy mountains and deep fjords. He called it Greenland. though much of it was not green. Still, some stayed. They built farms along the coast. They hunted seals and fished the cold waters. They carved out lives on the very edge of the known world. And one day, Eric's son, Leif, sailed even further. He followed the whispered tales of sailors who spoke of a land beyond Greenland. He crossed waters no Norseman had crossed before. And he found it, a strange shore with forests and wild grapes. A place unlike any they had known. They called it Vinland. The Norse had reached North America. For a brief time, they lived there. They built houses. They explored. They may have traded with the native peoples or fought them. The sagas do not agree. But the colony did not last. It was too far, too dangerous, too lonely. Eventually, they returned to Greenland, and Vinland became a story, one told by firelight. A dream of a land beyond the sea. By the 11th century, the world had changed again. Kings now ruled in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Churches stood in villages once guarded by wooden idols. Viking raids had dwindled. The longships, once feared across all Europe, now mostly stayed close to home. But the final chapter had one more twist. In 1066, a Viking king named Harald Hardrada sailed from Norway with a great army. He believed he had a claim to the English throne. He landed in the north and won a fierce battle. But then, near Stamford Bridge, his army met the forces of the English king, Harold Godwinson. In that battle, Harald Hardrada was slain. His death marked the end of the Viking Age of war. Ironically, just weeks later, another group of Norse descendants would succeed where Harold failed. William of Normandy, a great-great-grandson of Rollo, crossed the English Channel and won the crown at the Battle of Hastings. His victory did not come in longships, but on horseback, with knights and archers. The age of raiding had ended. The age of kingdoms had begun. Yet, even as the noise of swords faded, the legacy of the Vikings endured. In language, in law, in place names that still echo with Norse words, towns ending in, by, Thorpe, or, Wick. In stories, in the sagas of Iceland, written in the centuries that followed, capturing the lives, the losses, the dreams of a people who had once lived by wind and wave. In blood, in the DNA of millions across Europe and beyond, where the memory of seafaring ancestors lingers. But most of all, the Vikings live on in imagination, not as horned warriors, for they never wore such things, but as sailors who feared no ocean, as settlers who carved farms from rock and snow, as poets who remembered everything, as wanderers who saw the edge of the world and still went further. And when the wind rises on quiet northern nights, and the sea darkens beneath the moon, it is said you can still hear the creak of wood and the beat of oars. The old rhythm, the old longing, the old dream of a boat and a horizon in a place not yet known. The Viking Age is over, but its story, soft and steady, still sails on, while history often remembers the Vikings for their ships and their raids. Their true daily life was much quieter, far more ordinary than their legends suggest. Most Norse people were not warriors or explorers. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, mothers, fathers, people who woke each day not thinking of conquest, but of chores. The Norse world revolved around the rhythm of the land and the seasons. In spring, the fields were plowed with wooden tools, pulled by oxen. Barley and rye were sown, while animals were released to graze. Summer brought long days and hard work. Hay was cut, fish were dried, and the sun stayed up for hours on end. Autumn was the harvest. Grain was stored, livestock slaughtered, and homes prepared for the long, dark months ahead. Winter was for rest, stories, and survival. Viking homes were longhouses, wooden structures with turf roofs and central hearths. Families slept on raised platforms lined with furs. Smoke from cooking fires filled the air. It was warm and crowded, filled with the sounds of children, animals, and quiet conversations. In the evenings, people told stories of ancestors, gods, and travels across the sea. They sang songs, carved wood, spun wool, and repaired tools. Though the Norse world was patriarchal, women held a respected role. They managed households, made clothing, preserved food, and sometimes even owned land. In sagas, women are often portrayed as wise, strong-willed, and influential. Some wielded great authority in the absence of their husbands, and a few even sailed to distant lands or led in battle. Clothing was simple but practical. Wool was the most common fabric, dyed with plants and mosses into muted shades of blue, green, brown, and red. Men wore tunics and trousers, while women dressed in long gowns fastened with brooches. Jewelry was common, not just for decoration but also as a sign of status. Arm rings, beads, and pendants were often worn, sometimes passed down through generations. The Norse were not only farmers but skilled craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Carpenters built ships and homes. Weavers created fine textiles, and metalworkers shaped silver and bronze into intricate patterns. Trade was vital, connecting villages to wider markets. Furs, amber, soapstone, and iron were exchanged for silver, silk, spices, and wine from distant places. Markets were held regularly, at thing gatherings, where laws were made and disputes settled. Merchants set up stalls to sell goods. Coins were used, but barter remained common. A farmer might trade a sack of grain for a length of cloth. A hunter might offer pelts in exchange for a comb or a cooking pot. Education, as we think of it today, was rare. There were no schools, and most people did not read or write, but knowledge was passed down through memory. Children learned from watching, listening, and doing. They learned how to fish, how to mend a net, how to tell one star from another in the northern sky. Religion played a deep and personal role. The Old Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, were not distant figures. They were part of everyday life. Thor protected travelers. Freya was called upon for love and fertility. Odin watched over warriors. Offerings were made at home altars or in sacred groves. Ceremonies marked births, marriages, harvests, and death. Death, in Viking belief, was not the end. The soul could travel to many places. Warriors hoped to reach Valhalla, the hall of the slain. Others might go to hell, a realm of rest. Graves often included goods, tools, weapons, jewelry, food, to help the dead in the afterlife. Ships were sometimes buried with their owners. A final voyage into the unknown. Though they had a reputation for violence, the Norse also valued honor, loyalty, and hospitality. Guests were welcomed with food and warmth. Storytelling was a sacred art, and insults could lead to legal challenges. A man's reputation was everything. It was said that cattle die, and kinsmen die, but one thing never dies: the fame of a man's good deeds. Over time, the old ways began to change. As Christianity spread, churches were built beside longhouses. Priests began recording histories. New customs blended with the old. Yule feasts turned into Christmas. Sacred wells became holy sites. Families still gathered around the hearth, but now they spoke of Christ as well as Odin. The transition was slow, often peaceful, and deeply personal. Even in death, the change was visible. Christian burials were simpler, without grave goods. Crosses marked graves instead of stones. But the memories of the past did not vanish. In Iceland, the sagas were eventually written down, preserving the world of the ancestors for all time. In the quiet of a winter night, in a longhouse buried in snow, one could still hear the soft murmur of stories being told. A child curled beside the fire, listening not just to myths, but to history, the story of a people who sailed far, lived simply, and left behind more than just battles. They left behind a way of life, one rooted in seasons, in kinship, in courage, and in the endless sky. As time moved forward and kingdoms rose over old tribal lands, the Viking world did not vanish. It changed, it faded from daily life, but not from memory. And in one windswept island, far from the noise of empires, the stories remained. Iceland, remote and cold, became the quiet guardian of the Norse past. There, during long winters and silent nights, families passed down the tales of their ancestors. Stories that were spoken aloud, shaped by firelight and passed from voice to voice. Some tales were of gods who walked among men. Some told of voyages over oceans. Some whispered of love, betrayal, pride, and sorrow. These were the sagas. The Icelandic sagas are among the great treasures of world literature. They were first preserved not in stone or ink but in memory. Entire lifetimes of events were remembered word for word. 1,000 lines held in the mind. Generations kept the stories alive through repetition and reverence. To speak a saga was to honor the past. Eventually, in the 12th and 13th centuries, these stories were written down. Monks and scribes, using ink made from berries and blades of feather, carefully recorded the oral histories. The vellum pages were precious. Many were kept in churches or passed between families like holy objects. And so, what began as memory became manuscript. The sagas were not just myths. Many were historical. They told of real people, of farmers, warriors, poets, and wanderers. They described feuds between families, journeys to foreign lands, and decisions made under the weight of honor. There was no clear line between fact and story, but in the sagas, both became true. One might read of Egil Skallagrimsson, a warrior poet who composed verses before battles and defied kings with his words. Or of Gudrun Osvifsdottir, a woman of deep sorrow and wisdom, whose choices shaped the fate of her kin. Or of Grettir the Strong, haunted by ghosts and cursed by loneliness. Each character, though born in another age, feels strikingly human. Their thoughts, their flaws, their hopes, all remain familiar even after 1,000 years. The sagas also give us glimpses of the Viking world that no other source can. They tell us how people thought, how they spoke, how they understood their place in the world. In their pages, we learn about law and justice, marriage and inheritance, trade and travel, and the harsh code of honor that shaped every choice. What makes the sagas so powerful is not just their content, but their tone. They are simple, almost stark in their telling. Emotions are shown, not explained. A man may say little as he buries his son, but the silence says more than pages of poetry. The style is quiet, like snow falling over stone, but it carries weight, it endures. In a way, the sagas are a kind of time travel. When read slowly, when spoken aloud in a quiet room, they transport us. We sit again in the longhouse, feel the flicker of firelight, and listen to a voice that knows the names of those long gone. A voice that still remembers. Beyond the sagas, the Norse left other traces of memory. Runes, carved into stones, wood, and bone, speak in strange, angular letters. Some are messages of grief, others of victory. Some mark graves, others declare ownership. A few are riddles, or spells. Runes were more than writing. They were symbols of mystery and power. Even as Latin script spread, runes remained, stubborn and sacred. Archaeology, too, has helped bring the Viking world back to light. Burial sites, sunken ships, lost villages, all speak of lives once lived. A comb found beneath a house tells us someone cared about their hair. A bead from the east tells us of trade. A child's toy, forgotten under floorboards, tells us someone once laughed in that place. The past is not always grand. Sometimes, it is soft, ordinary, beautiful in its quiet details. Modern people often imagine the Vikings as loud and violent, but the deeper truth is more complex. Their world was rich in tradition, in memory, in imagination. They believed that words could outlive stone, that a good name was better than gold, and that every act echoed through generations. In this, they were right. Even now, the sagas are read, translated into many tongues, studied by scholars, adapted by storytellers. They inspire poems, novels, films, and games. But more than that, they remind us that stories are what we leave behind. Not buildings, not riches, stories. And in the sagas of Iceland, the Viking Age still lives. Not as a myth, but as memory, clear, cold, and endlessly alive. So when the night grows long, and the wind whispers beyond your window, imagine that you are not alone. Somewhere, in another time, someone once sat as you do now, listening to the voice of the past. A tale of ships and sorrow, of honor and snow, a tale without end. The story continues. Long after their sails vanished from the horizon, the Vikings left behind more than fear. They left footprints in language, in law, in place names, and even in blood. Their presence did not disappear with time. It blended quietly into the cultures they touched, like water sinking into soil, nourishing it in ways that might never be seen at first glance. In England, for example, traces of the Norse are everywhere. Many towns and villages carry names that begin or end with Norse words. Places ending in, by, like Grimsby or Derby, come from the Old Norse word for farm or settlement. The word, Thorpe, meant a small village. Thwaite meant a clearing. These names remain even today, whispered by signs and maps. But it was not only in names. The English language itself absorbed Norse sounds and structures. Everyday words like sky, egg, knife, window, and even the verb, to take, come from Old Norse. The pronouns, they, them, and their, also replaced older English forms. It is as though, in conversation, the Vikings still speak through us, subtly, constantly, unnoticed. Laws and customs changed too. The Danelaw, a region of England ruled by Viking settlers, developed its own blend of English and Norse traditions. Local assemblies, or things, became part of governance, even long after the Viking rulers faded. Their influence endured in how disputes were settled, how property was inherited, How villages were organized. In Ireland and Scotland, the Norse built coastal towns that would become lasting centers of trade and life. Dublin, for instance, began as a Viking settlement. They called it Dubh Linn, the Black Pool, from a cluster of huts beside a river. It grew into a bustling town where merchants gathered, ships docked, and silver coins changed hands. The Norse mixed with the Gaelic people, sometimes as foes, often as kin. In Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen, Viking settlers became the ancestors of dukes and lords. There, they adopted French language and customs, but their roots remained clear. One of their descendants, William the Conqueror, would cross the Channel in 1066 and forever change the history of England. So the Viking story did not end with their age. It echoed on through empire, monarchy, and myth. Farther still, their journeys shaped the world. The Norse who settled in Russia became part of the early formation of cities like Novgorod and Kiev. The Rus, as they were called, would give their name to Russia itself. They traded along rivers that stretched from the Baltic to Byzantium, acting as silent connectors between East and West. Even in the Arab world, stories of the Vikings lived on. Travelers from Baghdad wrote about the Norse they encountered along river routes. They marveled at their strength, their rituals, and their ways of mourning the dead. One account described a chieftain's funeral, the ship, the sacrifice, the fire, all recorded by a stranger's hand, preserved in a language foreign to the Norse, yet forever part of their story. In Greenland, their settlements clung to rocky shores for generations. They built churches, raised sheep, carved wooden crosses. Some dreamed of Vinland, the rich land farther west, and perhaps for a time, they made it there. Long before Columbus, long before maps, they may have stepped onto the shores of what we now call North America. But not all stories are of conquest or colonization. Some legacies are quieter. The Norse brought with them a spirit of exploration, of curiosity, of resilience in the face of hardship. These values, though not always visible, have shaped the cultures that followed them. In modern times, the Viking image has been reshaped many times. In the 19th century, romantic poets and painters imagined them as noble savages. In the 20th, their symbols were misused for darker purposes. And in today's world, they often appear in popular media, with horned helmets, roaring voices, and little regard for historical truth. Yet the real legacy of the Vikings is richer, more human, more surprising. It lives in the quiet corners of rural Iceland, where people still tell old stories by candlelight. It lives in the pages of sagas, where laughter and grief sit side by side. It lives in the language we speak, in the customs we keep, and in the places we call home. The Viking Age was not only about warriors. It was about change. It marked a transition between the ancient and the medieval. It connected isolated worlds. It challenged old powers and built new ones. It showed that people, no matter how far they travel, carry with them not just weapons, but stories, not just fear, but ideas. And in the long run, ideas are what last. As night falls over the North Sea, and mist curls over the remains of old longhouses, the world they knew may be gone. But listen closely. In the hush of trees, in the whisper of water, in the echo of a name spoken aloud, the Vikings are still with us. Not as ghosts, but as roots, deep, unseen, essential. The longships no longer sail, but their wake still ripples beneath the surface of our world. Time is not kind to memory. It weathers stories like the wind wears down stone. And yet, some stories remain. They slip into the rhythm of language, into the names of towns, into the lull of legends told to children before bed. The Viking world, with all its complexity and contradiction, is one such story. It began with the sea, with restless men watching the horizon, with the creak of wood and the salt of the wind. But it was never only about raids or treasure. It was about a way of seeing the world, a belief that land could be found where no map yet reached. That honor was worth pain, that one's name could last longer than one's body. Now, imagine the last of the longships. Imagine a quiet fjord, shrouded in fog. A single boat, smaller than those that once crossed oceans, glides across the still water. Its sails are lowered, its oars do not splash. On board, a man stares at the cliffs that rise around him. Perhaps he is a trader, perhaps a farmer, perhaps just an old man returning home. He carries nothing that the world will mark as great. No silver, no crown, no book of fame, only the sound of gulls above and the memory of journeys behind him. In many ways, that man is the end of the Viking Age. Historians sometimes assign dates, Try to draw clean lines between one era and the next. Some say the age ended in 1066, with the death of Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Others place its close with the Christianization of Scandinavia, when the old gods gave way to the cross. But history is rarely so sharp. More often, it fades gently, like the last light at dusk. The Vikings became neighbors, merchants, monarchs. Their children spoke new languages, worshipped new gods, built homes from stone instead of wood, wrote with ink instead of runes. The warrior became a farmer, the seafarer, a landholder, the raider, a ruler, and yet, something remained, a shadow of daring, a rhythm of poetry, a fire that never quite went out. Today, we walk through cities and towns that once heard the footfall of Norsemen. We study their tools in museums, their laws in books, their names in stone. We visit the burial mounds and try to hear the silence they left behind. We look at their jewelry, their ships, their weapons, and we imagine. We wonder what they saw, what they feared, what they loved. In Iceland, where the sagas were written, people still speak a version of the old tongue. It is said that a modern Icelander can read texts 1,000 years old and still understand. The past speaks almost clearly. It has not yet gone quiet. In Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and beyond, festivals still celebrate the old days, not as a return to violence, but as a memory of resilience, of survival, of change. The Vikings remind us that even in the harshest places, life can thrive, that people will always seek the edge of the map, that no culture is only its weapons, that music, myth, and memory endure. And what of the gods? What of Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom? Of Thor, who guarded mankind? Of Loki, who twisted every tale? They live now in stories, in symbols, in the pages of fantasy and the screens of cinema. But before all that, they lived in the minds of those who feared winter, longed for sunlight, and whispered to the sky for meaning. The gods are never gone. They only change form. We think of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a final battle, a world consumed by fire and flood. But even that story ends with rebirth, a new world rising from the ashes, a green earth, a dawn after destruction. The Norse did not only tell tales of endings, they also told of beginnings. Perhaps they knew that nothing truly ends, that even after silence, something speaks. So let us return to the sea. One last time, close your eyes and listen. Hear the slow creak of the ship's timber. Feel the steady pull of oars through dark water. The stars above are the same ones the Vikings watched. The moonlight falls on the waves as it did 1,000 years ago. Somewhere in the deep, something ancient stirs, a memory, a name, a lullaby in a lost language. The journey is long, but not lonely. Behind us are sagas, ahead of us, dreams, and all around, the endless rhythm of time, slow, soft, and full of echoes. Sleep now, gentle listener. The world of the Vikings drifts behind you like a fading shore. Let it rest, let it breathe, let it dream again, until the stories return.